Hello everyone and welcome to our series of online webinars hosted by our friends, experts, winemakers and the sommeliers of 67 Pall Mall. Please look on our website where dates and themes are continuously being added, and we have a really full itinerary extending well into mid-June with some really exciting webinars to keep you motivated, hydrated, even inebriated. Tomorrow we're going to be speaking with Istvan Sepsi Jr., who will be explaining his family's wines and their extraordinary history in the shaping of the wines of Tokaj in Hungary. Then Anne McHale, MW, will be talking about the resurrection of Beaujolais. Then we have our very own Terry Candilis, and he'll be explaining the exceptional wines on the island of Santorini. And finally, Raj Par and Sasu Morman will be telling us about their great Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs that they're making down in Santa Barbara. And for now, it's a real great pleasure to welcome Eric Baugher, the winemaker at the legendary Ridge Winery in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California. So please do chat away at the side. Please share with us what you are drinking and where you are drinking it from. Please make sure to set to all panelists and attendees. And also, if you can, take a photo and share it on social media with the hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end so you can ask questions to Eric then. Please write your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box at the side. It makes things much easier to sort through. So we hope you have a really great bottle of Ridge open and decanted, and a big welcome, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's great to be here. Good evening, everyone over there in London. And I'm coming to you from within the Bello cellar. This is the room that this great Bello is barrel aged in. I've behind me a bunch of American oak barrels. It's a great property to work at. I've now been here for 26 vintages working with the legendary Paul Draper, the winemaker who hired me back in 1994 to join him in running this very complex operation. A winery at the top of a mountain. This was first planted and the winery built in the 1800s. So this whole mountain was covered with vineyards before Prohibition ended most of the operation. So Ridge started up in the late 50s, and they restored one of the wineries on this mountain that had been abandoned. And the founders, they were all scientists, so working down at the laboratories of Stanford Research Institute. That was their day job. On the weekends, they came up to the mountain, worked on the winery, took care of the vines, made their first little test barrel of Montebello in 1959, and really loved the quality of what they were able to produce. They got inspired to then proceed to officially reopen the winery in 1962, where they had the government bond in place to actually be able to commercially produce their first vintage. So in 1962, they ventured into the world of making Cabernet from this mountain site using old world winemaking techniques. So in the 1850s Bordeaux, that was the recipes that they adopted in farming and for winemaking here, which was really minimalist approach to keeping your hands off of the process as much as possible, let the natural transformation of grape to wine take place. And your role in wine making was really just to keep everything on a good track towards bottle with all the great quality. So Paul Draper then joined in the late 60s, and that was for him his first California experience in wine making. So he had gotten most of his wine training in Italy and in the Southern Hemisphere in Chile, where he had set up a small wine operation in the mountainous area where they were producing Cabernet. So he came back to California. He had gone to Stanford, so he was affiliated with the university and was at a function where the founders of Ridge were at, and they met, they talked, and Paul was brought up to look at the operation and taste the wines, and he was just really enamored at the quality of what the founders were producing with their 62, 64 vintages and how similar they were to the wines of Bordeaux. And he really thought there was some great potential here at this site. And so he joined and made this his life. And then, as the decades went on, began to play around with Zinfandel, as well as really working harder on making beautiful Chardonnay from the same mountain site where Montebello was grown. And just over time really brought a great discipline to Ridge. You know, you have to look at Ridge in the early 60s and into the late 60s as Paul joined. You know, it was family members here working the vines, working the wines in the cellar. You know, there was really no discipline or order or organization. I mean, they were doing a great job, but you know, the quality of the vintages would go up and down with the weather, and if they weren't really on top of it with the discipline that was really needed, you know, they saw wild swings in quality from vintage to vintage. So Paul joined and really then, you know, kind of brought on a team of workers in the vineyard and in the cellar. And with his approach and discipline, really helped elevate, step up the quality here at Ridge to a point where now the vintages didn't see so much of a swing from year to year. You know, part of that was the whole approach, like in Bordeaux, of doing selection. So tasting everything before committing to an assemblage by taking pieces out that were the lesser pieces so that you could, in that more challenging year, be able to make a really outstanding wine, but maybe make less of it. So as the decades went on, of course, Ridge just got better and better, much more well-known. Paul knew to have a great reputation at home, you had to also be abroad in the export markets of the major wine markets of the world. And so, of course, the UK was the first point of Ridge sold outside the United States. So we've been present in the UK market for, I want to say, close to 50 years or approaching 50 years. So we've really have done a great job of really getting well-known, respected by all the major wine reviewers and consumers around the world. But to have maintained that level of prestige, we've had to really just continue to push the envelope on quality. So that was kind of where I was brought in. I mean, I had no background in enology and viticulture prior to Ridge. I basically have learned everything about wine by working here at this same property all this time with the master, Paul Draper. And I, of course, came here with a really good in-depth background in science, so biochemistry and molecular biology. So I really understood everything on that chemical level of what was going on in fermentation. But luckily, I also grew up in a family that had an appreciation for great wine. So I was raised on good wine in the area, not too far from Montebello. So I had already this love for wine, a love for farming, everything about it. And I kind of built my life around it, just much like Paul built his life here. And when Paul hired me, his insistence was really just keep pushing the envelope on quality every year. Let's just not rest on our laurels and just be satisfied with, you know, what we've got. Let's just keep figuring out how we can make the wine better and better, maybe making some minor adjustments in our techniques, but again, never abandoning the natural approach, you know, staying within this really solid recipe of making wine naturally and keeping our hands off of it. So that's really required a lot of our focus in what we do in the vineyard. We really spend a great amount of our time outdoors. You know, before we plant a parcel, we really study the soil and the aspect and the microclimate to really make sure that we've got the right rootstock and vine growing in that soil that's going to give us the best chance of raising a crop that will have all the essential elements of great wine, where my job in winemaking, again, is just guide that transformation of this beautiful fruit into this amazing liquid. And then in cellaring it and aging it out to bottle, just keeping it very on that straight and narrow path of maintaining the quality and flavor all the way to the bottle. So it's been a great time here at Ridge. I mean, when I had graduated with my degree in biochemistry, I had dreamed of this world of biotech, which is really huge here in Silicon Valley. But I decided to build my life around wine. I mean, within that first year staying here, I decided this was really a special place to operate. It's historic. the winery's been here for over 130 years, and it's been making great wine all this time. It is a special terroir to work with, as well as all these other great Zinfandel vineyards. I mean, when Ridge went out in pursuit of working with the historic grape of California, Zinfandel, that was brought into the States during the Gold Rush era, you find these old abandoned, Zinfandel vineyards across the state. And I mean, the great thing about Zin and the beauty of it is that it can survive a really long time. It's got great longevity. And so you can go into some of these remote areas of Sonoma County and find these old patches of Zinfandel vines to work with. And so over our last 60 years, we've been able to play around with these different old Zinfandel vineyards across the state of California. Some as far east as the Sierra Nevada mountain range, kind of at the foothill. There were some vineyards in Shenandoah Valley and Fiddletown. That was kind of a bit too far for the winery to go to get the fruit, and being so inland, it was always kind of tricky to get good flavor development without the high alcohol. So we kind of stayed more coastal and Sonoma, so going higher latitude and closer to the ocean to get more ocean moderating effect. Really today, most of the Zin that we're harvesting is coming from really the three most important appellations, which is Dry Creek Valley, Alexander Valley, and Russian River. Those are kind of the most optimal location for Zinfandel to grow, where you've got warm days, but cool nights. But it allows the fruit to hang and get good flavor development without high alcohol levels. So it's again, just been nice making my life here at the winery. It's very quiet these days. In fact, I'm the only one in this room. I'm quarantining myself in the very special room with hundreds of barrels of Monte Bello. So it can't get better than that. The rest of my team, they kind of spread out in different cellars. Right now, we're doing a lot of work on 2019 vintage wines, where we're doing the quarterly racking. We actually have had just a perfect moon for helping with gravitational clarification. So we've been busy decanting off clear wine out of the barrels, washing the sediment away, putting the wine back, and we've been going through lot by lot, making those rackings for going into summertime. I also have some bottling coming up. So, we never rush a wine to bottle. That goes back to day one at Ridge. It's about making sure the wines are totally together and integrated. Tannins are in balance. That's the moment when we decide to put a wine to bottle. And so I've got a number of wines from the 18 vintage that I've just felt needed much more time. And so I actually have some barrels of 18 Montebello right next to me. We'll probably begin to pull this wine out towards the end of May, early June to go to bottle. And then in bottle, once the wine's there, then it kind of just sits, it rests, and we're never going to rush a wine out to market if it's gone into bottle shock. It just kind of needs to have that chance to wake up and kind of begin to soften. So I'm an ardent supporter for natural cork. We're using the most beautiful 2-inch corks that you can find. Really hard to get in California, so I tend to have to place my cork orders about a year in advance to make sure that my suppliers can find those batches and hand sort, select, test for TCA, and then air freight over to me in time for bottling. So it's important, I think, given that wine is a natural product, it's of the earth, it's going to express the season, certainly of the vintage. I just think wine really does need to be in touch with something that's natural as well. And the cork being of the same species as an oak barrel, of the Quercus family, it does actually have a lot of similar flavors. And so that is part of the reason why when I'm selecting corks, I actually soak the cork lot in a jar filled with the Chardonnay. I let it sit overnight, pour it off, and then taste and just see what are those natural flavors that extract from the cork. Are they what I like? Or are they, not as interesting? And so there's a lot that goes into it, including even the barrels I buy. I'm in the middle right now of deciding what the cooperage will be for 2020 vintage. And I've just been in this room tasting through all the different experiments of different forests, different toast levels, seasoning time, all the different oak variables to really pinpoint those barrels that are working, those that are less interesting or not working as well, so that I can refine the mix for the 2020 vintage. So a lot of tasting goes into everything we do here. And I guess I was very lucky 26 years ago when I joined that I had the palate. I had the ability to taste. I can really see those fine nuances of flavor and character. Probably the most interesting wine to assemble at Ridge. I mean everything is pretty amazing to assemble, especially Monte Bello Cabernet. But one that really relies so much on my sense of aroma and taste is the Chardonnay production. This is a small production. Until we started making a Grenache Blanc from Paso Robles last year, Chardonnay was our one and only white wine that we've ever made at Ridge, and it was always from this property of Montebello. So in 1962, when the founders started up, they were making Cabernet and a small amount of Chardonnay. As time went on, the Chardonnay vines became so diseased that the yields were down to about 1/8 of a ton an acre. So the block got ripped out in 1986. And it took a while before Chardonnay production came back online. So they actually started going further down the mountain and planting Chardonnay at a point below the fog line. So this mountain is a very steep mountain. It goes from about 500-foot elevation at the base on up to 2,700 feet. Our Chardonnay is grown right at about 1,200 to 2,000 feet. And it's embedded in the limestone. You can see the chunks there with the Chardonnay growing right next to it. It's a fractured limestone mountain. The limestone in the wintertime will be saturated as we get a fair amount of rain here. Typically, most years we're going to see anywhere between 20 and 35 inches of rain. And it's spread out over time between like December and May. And so it just gets soaked into the rock. The vines then have their deep root system going through the fissures, pulling up that mineral-rich water. And, we basically don't irrigate any of our Chardonnay vines, and they're just left to go natural. The typical yield of our Chardonnay vines, now that they've got some good age on them, it's about 2 to 2.5 tons an acre. And we're often into the vines harvesting right around early September to mid-September, sampling first, tasting the fruit on the vine, collecting berry samples, measuring the sugar and tasting the juice. And where it's like really green, we hold off from picking. But as soon as green moves to just that hint of ripe, we pull the fruit off. So the intent with our Chardonnay is to come in, whole cluster press, the juice out, barrel it down, and let it go through a natural fermentation in the cellar and keep the alcohols within reason. So the ideal for us is low 14, even lower if we can get the fruit off earlier, which is really determined by the growing conditions of the year. Now, we do have a clone here in California that was bred by UC Davis back in, I think, the 40s. It's clone 4, and it was kind of a Chardonnay variety to grow in the Central Valley of California for very high yield and high sugar content. Unfortunately, that was a clone that was put into the ground on our really deficient, poor soil at Montebello, where it stunts its ability to produce to 2 tons, 2.5 tons, but it still will put out sugar. It's a really efficient photosynthesizer of a clone. And so as we've been looking at developing other parcels on this mountain, we've been going to other older clones that have come to California, mainly the old 1T selections. And there we're seeing flavor development at lower sugar levels. So we've been really fortunate about, in more recent vintages, bringing that alcohol level down as we've gotten more clonal diversity going in the vineyard. So this 17 Chardonnay estate is a really powerful wine. And again, as I've been talking about, the interest and intrigue of making the assemblage, you really do approach this assemblage more like a perfumist, because the most amazing thing with natural yeast fermentation in barrel with the Chardonnay juice is that every barrel, being its own vessel, is going to develop its own unique mix of different Cerevisiae strains that are going to impact flavor, essential oil development. And so you can fill the juice across a wide range of barrels and let them all go natural, all under the same condition. It's a cellar that's below ground, so it's earth temperature. With that, you have this nice, slow, steady, cold fermentation that generally takes about 4 months to finish. But as you go through, and you can taste that wine, finished wine, after the natural yeast fermentation, and one barrel will taste totally different than the barrel right next to it. So you have all these different variations of flavor that have evolved from the natural yeast, from that one plot of land. Then you could go to the next plot that might be slightly higher up the mountain on a different slope and terrace, and you're going to see the same random wild differences there. And so you end up at the end of all the vinification, as you're getting ready to assemble, you have, anywhere between 130, 150 variables of tasting to play around with and add into the assemblage or hold out, where you're going to have aromatics and essential oils and all these different synergies at play to create this beautiful Chardonnay. So of course, we're fans of white Burgundy here. I mean, anytime I'm going to do a comparative tasting with RSA Chardonnay, it's really not going to be with any other California Chardonnay, because there's no similar terroir here in any other site. And so I'm usually looking to Burgundy as great examples. And, and I love the elements of the surly aging. I'm using in Chardonnay American oak barrels, a few French, but mostly American oak. And we're doing long surly aging. We're doing batonnage throughout the malolactic period. And, I'm trying to draw into this wine some of those really rich, complex flavors that evolve with long barrel aging. But once we make the assemblage and the chosen barrels have been identified, we'll do a clean rack to an assemblage tank, wash solely out of the oldest barrels, return the blend to those older neutral barrels where it can sit another 5 months, and with that have total gravitational clarification. Approaching bottling then, that date of bottling is really determined by the moon and kind of the tide schedule of the San Francisco Bay. So as we're starting to see really good, strong negative king tides, that's when we know the moon is in a good position. It's pulling strong against the barrel, pulling down, so we can do a clean decant and go to bottle with no fining and no filtration. So it's truly untouched Chardonnay. And with that, you have the full potential of all the wonderful elements of this wine showing through. And again, with careful use of American oak, we've found that there are forests in America where there's great integration with this wine. It doesn't mark the wine in a dominant way. We've been very careful about whose barrels and what forest the oak is coming from, and also the proportions of how much is new oak and how much is older barrels. And kind of finishing off the wine in the most neutral barrels for that last 5 months also helps the wine incorporate any new oak element from the beginning of the assemblage, where over those 5 months, it will kind of weave into the flavors and at bottling be totally integrated into the wine. But you can see, I mean, it's lively acid, lots of minerality. It's got a lot of glycerin and body. It's a Chardonnay that's really made to age. And this is just our estate bottling. So this is kind of our entry Chardonnay. You know, we do a special selection beyond this, and that's a very small production. Not much of it's ever sold outside the winery, but that will be the Monte Bello Chardonnay. So I know Berry Brothers has some of our older vintages. I'm not sure they have any of our recent bottlings, but you know, it's definitely a wine to search out, because it's just this, it's the beautiful quality of this wine just taken to a whole nother higher level of where the minerality is so pronounced and the acidity is even firmer, so it can go on for decades. Whereas the estate bottling, we figure it's more like a 10 to 15 year aging Chardonnay, which is far beyond what most California Chardonnays can do. But it's a lovely Chardonnay. I mean, it's really the only Chardonnay I drink from California. I mean, there's few others, but mostly I love our Chardonnay so much, and it produces such beautiful style. But moving on, we should go on to the Zinfandel now. This is a beautiful grape variety to work with. You know, it's an ancient grape. I mean, now that the origins of Zinfandel are known to the Dalmatian coast of Croatia, cuttings were brought over to Italy, where it was planted as Primitivo. Cuttings came across the Atlantic into the New World, and was kind of grown as a table grape, because, I mean, it's just such a flavorful grape. Just Zinfandel is just so luscious, and, you know, it has so much fruit. It's a pleasurable fruit to eat, but it's, of course, also wonderful to make into wine. So a lot of the cuttings were brought over by Italians during the gold rush in the late 1840s, early 50s, and planted all throughout the Sierra Nevada mountain range where the gold rush was taking place. Now, as the gold rush kind of faded out, a lot of Italians stayed out west here in California and moved out of the mountains into valley spots and into remote locations with their cuttings. So by the 1880s, Zinfandel started to become the dominant grape of California. Vineyards planted everywhere. A lot of winemaking was going on in that time. And, you know, of course, Phylloxera had done a number on a lot of vineyards that were planted in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, as they were all self-rooted. But by the 1878 or so, that's when they discovered rootstocks, and St. George was really the one rootstock that saved a lot of these old vineyards. So most of what we work with today, like at Lytton and Geyserville, all those ancient vines are all grafted. They survive Phylloxera. And they narrowly survived the Prohibition, which took place in 1919. So East Bench was a site in Dry Creek Valley that did not survive. It had vines there in the 1890s, but they were let go during the 13 years of Prohibition. So the owner of the land just converted it to an orchard. You know, that kind of went away, and then it became pasture land, grazing land for cattle and sheep. So we took out a long-term lease on this property in 1998. And so we started clearing the land back, and we planted in East Bench our 4 favorite old heritage clones of Zinfandel. So we have kind of a selection masal of our favorite old Zins on different rootstocks to give us some rootstock diversity. And we planted it only to Zinfandel. So we didn't do this crazy exotic mix of what a lot of the winemakers of the 1800s were doing, creating these elaborate blends in the field. Instead, we just planted it to pure Zinfandel. And it's at the tip top of Dry Creek Valley on this really beautiful Terra Rosa red, iron red soil. It's organic as well. So it's actually the first wine that Ridge has bottled with it stating organic grapes on the ingredient line of the back label. Because we figured, I mean, starting off fresh with this land, why not just from day one farm it organically? And so these vines have never seen anything besides just elemental sulfur that's sprayed for, mildew control in the growing season. We do a lot of our insect control by releasing predatory insects that go after the bad bugs. We also create these insectary rows down every other vine row to create these natural habitats where there's these unique flowers that are the attractants to draw in and maintain a population of the predatory insects. And so it's really one of these fabulous vineyards to visit. I mean, there you see it, the iron-rich soil. You can almost smell it in this wine every year. As the vines have just gotten older, with their roots getting deeper, they really have amplified their terroir in such a beautiful way. I mean, you could smell, it's almost like pottery and kind of clay. And before we started producing this as a single vineyard wine, we're always a little worried about maybe we should have planted some other mixed varieties in the field to give this wine a little bit more color, a little bit more tannin structure. But tasting this wine today, I'm so glad we didn't, because this terroir, the zins that we have planted, there's enough richness of color and tannin within those Zinfandel selections that it really makes a complete wine on its own. It doesn't need the help of Petit Syrah or the assistance of Carignan to provide more acidity. It really is a site that is really ideal for just Zinfandel. And so we've been making this wine as a standalone single vineyard since 2006. And again, as the vines have matured, they have just really been able to produce greater quality, especially as the vines now with some age, they're starting to regulate their growth. That's generally the biggest problem with Zinfandel when they're young, is they want to grow like weeds. And so they just will put out these massive canopies and big crops, lots of clusters. And so you have to go through every year and seriously put them back, pull leaves, and as they're growing, drop fruit and cut back shoots. So you really have to kind of pull the vine back and do a lot of hedging to slow it down and kind of beat the vine up a bit to get it to focus its energy into the fruit. And so we generally get about 4 to 5 tons an acre on this block because, after having decades of cattle and sheep roaming the land, there's a lot of nutrients available to the vines in the ground. And so those vines are always in that mode of, lots of vigor. But they're now slowly running out of nutrients and beginning to deplete the soil. And now we're starting to see the vines get into a better rhythm of quality and less yield. So it's really been fun to watch this vineyard develop. And it's great to be able to taste 100% Zinfandel in the heart of Dry Creek Valley, which is really considered the best of the appellations where Zinfandel is grown. And this wine is made by my colleague up at the Lytton Springs Winery. So John Olney made this. I made the very first vintage when it was brought down here. We hadn't quite finished construction of the Lytton Springs Winery. And so the first year, 2002, that first crop came down to me and I fermented it. But luckily we got the new winery built at Lytton Springs in time for the 2003 harvest. And so John has been there working hard on these vineyards and getting the quality, really promoted. So John joined about 2 years after I started here. He, of course, came with some good wine background and some knowledge on the wine merchant side. And it's been great working with him and Paul together as a team here, really pushing quality with everything we do. So John's fortunate to have had the ability to really design the new Lytton Springs Winery all around Zinfandel. So what I have here at Monte Bello, when I joined, was really more situated around working with Cabernet. And so over the decades, Paul has allowed me to take out some fermenters, bring in some new ones, and really kind of reconfigure it slightly to be able to do a little bit more of a mix of Zinfandel and Cabernet. I mean, we still, even with having the Lytton Springs Winery completed and built, we still do make a number of the Zinfandels here at Montebello, which means picking, trucking the fruit here, you know, driving it up the mountain, but, you know, also having the Lytton Springs Winery right there in the heart of Dry Creek Valley. It's great for really bringing the fruit freshly picked right to the winery. You know, they can get right on it, crushing it. And then they have, again, a lot of the tanks are designed around fermenting Zinfandel, where they can do submerged cap, you know, smaller tanks where they could break up the vineyards and only pick a certain amount a day. Because of being right there in proximity to the vineyard, they can just decide to pick out a small section of one block, bring it into a small fermenter, work it, next day, go in, get the rest of the block, bring it in. So they can really do a lot of strategic picking. Whereas for me to truck it down, it makes better sense to efficiently fill out the truck. So, you know, I still make Geyserville, 25 blocks there. You know, we're picking that over about a 3-week period of time, but I'm trying to bring down full truckloads. So, you know, it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes it's just half a truck of grapes that day, but we're still optimizing that, you know, the ripeness and phenolic ripeness and trying to get the truck down to Montebello and avoid over ripeness. So we still do a lot of truckloads down to Montebello. But East Bench is just this luscious Zinfandel. You know, it's young vine, so it's going to be really fruit forward, beautiful balance of tannins. You know, you're not going to have the additional structure coming in from having Petit Syrah, but there's still a wonderful structure. I think that's really more of a characteristic of Dry Creek Valley as an appellation. The character, you can taste that across a lot of Zinfandels made by other producers. The general theme is that the wines tend to be more savory. They can show more kind of a brighter fruit, and they tend to be much more structured. So they're ageable Zins, and they're wonderful when they have bottle age. So next we should try the Lytton Springs. So this is a vineyard we've worked with for roughly, gosh, I'm going to say it's close to 40 years. It will be 40 years in the 2022 vintage. So this is connected to East Bench. It's just a little bit lower elevation. There's 5 different soil types that make up the total of the terroir of the Lytton vineyard. You've got a range from like alluvial gravel riverbed to heavy dense clay and iron rich, and then you've got some in between. So the vineyard has to be broken up into a lot of small pickings. Probably want to say it's close to about 35 different blocks that make up the total Lytton Springs vineyard. And so you've got the oldest vines at the eastern edge, right outside the doors of the Lytton Springs Winery. Those were planted in 1901 through 1912. So, you know, beautiful head prune vines, you know, again, all organic. We started moving this vineyard towards organic right around the same time we started East Bench, planting East Bench. So it's been this gradual transition towards full organic. We just haven't totally gotten 100% of the vineyard blocks converted over organic. We're in the last phase of the last transition block. So it should be soon. I want to say maybe 2020 or 2021, I think, is our expected date of when we will have 100% of Lytton Springs certified organic. And at that point, we can put the words organic grapes on the ingredient line of the label. So until then, I mean, even if it's 95%, we're still not going to put it on there. The US government doesn't allow us to put that ingredient unless it's 100%. And so even where it's not organic, I mean, it's really, we've always been super light-handed. I mean, not using herbicides or pesticides. Occasionally within, probably the one thing that would, you know, forbid being organic is the use of a mildewcide during those really challenging wet years. But even that's now gone. I mean, as we've converted over fully to organic and we're in the transition of the last blocks, there is no chemical inputs at all in the vineyard. And so and in winemaking, you know, it's basically just freshly crushed grapes. A small amount of SO2 sulfite is added at crush. That helps ensure a healthy, clean, natural fermentation where the SO2 is helping inhibit the kind of the vineyard yeast and, you know, the microflora that's not ultimately going to carry out a fermentation, help select for Saccharomyces cerevisiae so that it gets the upper hand. It can begin to create alcohol as the fermentation proceeds, and that creates inhibition to the other microbes so that ultimately Saccharomyces wins out. It can ferment to dryness. Then we allow natural malolactic. We don't inoculate. And so that can take some time. And so while the wine is just sitting in a tank, malolactic will slowly begin. It will finish. Then we make our first real SO2 addition before we barrel down. And what we've always talked about here is the minimum effective SO2. So keeping the total free sulfite levels as low as possible, but not so low that we're starting to see random spoilage, oxidation, volatile acidity forming. You know, we have to be very conscious about sanitation in the fermenters and, you know, in the cellar. But we will make these additions of SO2 that are generally about a third of what most wines contain. And we're going to make these small additions as we're cleaning the wine, racking, doing our quarterly racking. So we'll make these small additions just to maintain this basic low level of protection to get to bottle. And in bottle have levels that are, again, a third of what most wines contain in total sulfite. So that's how we can get to bottle with really minimum effect on the wine. We feel that, you know, heavy dosing the wine with sulfur during barrel aging just inhibits what those positive reactions are, you know, where you have oxygen moving through the pores and interacting with the wine. If you've got a lot of SO2 in the wine, it totally stunts any development of the wine and dulls the flavors. It makes it really difficult to even enjoy the wine. And so we've, you know, part of my first year here at Ridge was really studying that whole approach and figuring out what is the best level. So we did a bunch of experiments, we tasted a lot, and we really dialed in that, you know, with our careful sanitation protocols, we can live with these low levels, but, you know, knowing that there could always be some spoilage that can bloom, you know, so part of what we do here is really constant tasting and surveying the cellar and making sure that wines, even with those low levels, are not beginning to show spoilage. So it keeps us busy. I'll say you know, we have a lot of sleepless nights here. Now, if I was a winemaker who had done all my training at UC Davis, where the enologist professors promote and advocate adding cultured yeast, adding nutrients, adding malolactic bacteria, adding this and that, adding heavy SO2, you know, those wines are going to be going to barrel totally sterile and stable, and, you know, you don't have anything to worry about. I could sleep, but it's just not the way to make fine wine. So we live on the edge. It's risky winemaking. Even the UC Davis professors have always called us kind of reckless winemakers. You know, what we do here is just totally risky, and, you know, it's going to lead to spoilage and this and that. And Paul and I were invited to do a tasting with the professors and their students, about 5 years ago. So we brought examples of our beautiful wines that were made totally natural with minimum SO2, tasted, and of course we first had to endure a lot of their own experiments where they were attempting to do natural winemaking. And it just showed that, you know, without proper sanitation protocols, there's no way to do it. You know, even in their facility as students, they just could not achieve anything great with their natural fermentation. So it was really painful tasting those wines. But we came then with ours, tasted, everyone was just blown away. Even the professor was like, wow, I mean, you know, you guys have have figured out how to do it. And, you know, we really look at Bordeaux. I mean, they've been making wine that way for centuries. I mean, it's not anything new. It's just, you know, what is your philosophy on winemaking? And, you know, our approach is just have healthy fruit coming into the winery. And with that, as long as you've got really clean fruit, you can take the risk, can make the wine this way. And then as you're doing élevage and really watching the wines in the cellar as they're developing, you have to be tasting all the time, and which I don't mind doing. I love the wine we make, so it's always a pleasure to go into the cellar and taste. But let's go back to the Lytton Springs here. 2017, I mean, we are tasting 2017 so far, and that was kind of the recovery year after a 5-year mega drought that we experienced in California. It kind of ravaged the vines. After 5 years of minimum water, they really began to suffer and struggle. 17 was kind of the vintage that saved us. You know, we ended up with 250% of normal rainfall. So the ground got saturated. There was lots of floods in California. Montebello Road was washed out. It was kind of disaster of a winter. But, you know, the vines got the water that year. They didn't necessarily come out with a big crop just because they didn't have the energy, but they got water. They had this nice warm summer. And with that much sun, it really, really helped infuse great flavor and rich color and tannin. And so we harvested in September. Now, what's beautiful about Lytton Springs Vineyard is that it is an exotic steel blend of Zinfandel, followed by Petit Syrah. Third grape is Carignan. And then you have this random mix of the Tinturia varieties like Alicante, Boucher, Grand Noir. You've got some white grapes. And it was kind of this recipe that they settled on back in the 19th century that worked for making much more robust, beautiful Zinfandel. And 17 is that in the glass. I mean, really powerful wine. It's got a really deep nose and, you know, some really savory herbs and, you know, that garrigue and floral notes. Oh, I mean, it's definitely a wine that shows terroir. In blind tasting, I would easily be able to identify this as Lytton Springs. It's very characteristic of the past vintages we've made. And definitely on the palate, it's got the weight and structure almost of a claret where it's going to go on for decades. And there's nothing more beautiful than drinking a Lytton Springs when it's 20, 30 years old. I mean, gosh, I was fortunate being here over my time of being able to taste back to some of these early years of pretty much every wine. But just some of my fondest memories of tasting Zinfandel, aged Zinfandel with Lytton Springs and Geyserville, you know, when those wines have lots of bottle age. Yeah, it's a fabulous wine. Now moving on, and we should go on to the Geyserville. I'm going to keep on our time schedule here. So Geyserville is the one zin that has been made by Ridge for the longest amount of time. It goes back to 1966 when the first Geyserville was produced. In the early years, it was a grower contract, much like Lytton Springs was, you know, buying the grapes, you know, being at the mercy of the grower. But, you know, as time went on, Geyserville just being such a beautiful vineyard of old wine, producing such beautiful, consistent quality year after year, Ridge was able to negotiate with the family that owned the land to let Ridge lease it and farm it. So that lease was signed in 1990, and from there we were able to go in and take some blocks on that special piece of ground that were producing white wine. They had all sorts of random things growing on it, and we were able to take those vines out and replant Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, some more Mataro, and you know, continue to really make huge improvements in the viticulture there with our techniques and farming. We then also at the same time as the East Bench began to convert gradually the blocks over to organic to the point where now we're we're in that same home stretch as Lytton. I mean, by 2021, we should be totally 100% certified. And so this is a single terroir. Unlike Lytton, you've got these rolling hills, you've got the 5 different soil types that make up Lytton. Geyserville is this flat piece of ground. It has a slight slope to it, west to east, but it is a washout of the ancient Russian River that is actually a mile to the east of the vineyard. But, you know, several million years back, you know, there was a huge washout from the mountains above where, you know, it deposited this mound of river rock and stone right on the western edge of Alexander Valley. And it's in this narrow stretch of soil. It's about a half a mile wide by 3 miles long. We've got our Whitten Ranch planted right across it, and that's where our oldest vines are located. So the oldest vines of this vineyard date back to 1882. It was producing great wine back in the 19th century. It was producing beautiful wine through Prohibition. The reason why Lytton Springs and Geyserville exist today is that they survived Prohibition because they were producing such beautiful wine quality. The growers didn't have it in their heart to rip the vines out and replant orchards. There was still demand for home winemaking at that time. So these great vineyards, there was still enough demand to keep those vines going and for those growers to sell grapes to the local, mostly Italians that wanted the grapes for winemaking. In the US during Prohibition, it was still legal to make wine at your household, up to 200 gallons per year for each family. And so that, again, kept demand going for these vineyards to put out a crop every year. And what's really special about this vineyard is the high percentage of Carignan that is in the mix. So as you go from Dry Creek Valley, which is just about a mile to the west, as you go into Alexander Valley, you kind of go into a different recipe that the farm, you know, the founding farmers established for their Alexander Valley sites. They planted Zinfandel with Carignan mostly, and they planted it that way just to give Zinfandel a lot more acidity. And so Geyserville is this really special piece of ground on river rock. There's a lot of calcium as well in the soil. It has this tendency to really put out grapes with high acid, and that really has a huge impact on kind of the direction, the spectrum of fruit. It tends to go more towards stone. So it's going to be more like plum, cherry, you know, high acid, juicy, exotic, and you smell it immediately in the 17. I mean, it's just such a unique wine, so different than the Lytton Springs, and yet geographically they're only separated by about 1.5 miles. And yet the soils are so different, and it has such a huge impact on the vineyard character. And then of course with the Carignan really gives it just this really intense, higher toned, perfumed fruit and juicier acid on the palate. It's an elegant grape as well, so it kind of helps kind of moderate the tannin structure of the Zinfandel. And so it's a really luscious Zinfandel, or well, I'd say more sensuous than luscious. I mean, it's just this, it drinks like silk. It's super smooth, super round. The tannins are polished, and with the acidity, it just makes this Zinfandel pair so well with food. In fact, that's what I had last night was a bottle of Geyserville because of its high acid. I paired it with a dish I made for my wife to celebrate Mother's Day, and it was just so wonderful. I mean, I love our wines with food because they really are made with balance in mind and complexity, and to ensure that there's good acidity as well, so that the wine is not overtaking the food's not overtaking the wine. There's really good synergy between the two. And so I love Geyserville. I mean, this is still the vineyard that comes down to Monte Bello that I work with. still have a number of other zins I work with, but this is really a special piece of ground. I mean, to have that riverbed rock, it's almost Chateauneuf-du-Pape-like in the stone and the rock, highly reflective. So you get that enhancement with sunlight coming up into the canopy. It's a lower valley, so the fog actually from the Pacific will come through that valley earlier in the day, cooling the nights down to lower temperatures. It's the last to burn off, so the fog kind of persists there long enough that you see these huge temperature, diurnal temperature variations, which also have a real positive effect of helping color development, flavor development, moderating the sugar accumulation, and ensuring good acidity in the fruit. So it makes just this fabulous, juicy Zinfandel. Barrel aged in American oak. A lot of the barrels I source for Geyserville are from Appalachia. So it's Kentucky oak. It's an older forest. The trees grow slower, so it's tighter grain wood. It's sweeter wood. It has a better integration into the wine without overwhelming the flavors. And we're usually in barrel for about 15 months. And then we bottle, we give it bottle age, and then it's put into release, usually in the springtime. And it's singing. And I think it's just gonna get better, even with more decades on it. I think 17 is gonna be one of those collectible years. And I can't wait for the COVID outbreak to be over so I can be out enjoying some of these older vintages in restaurants and, make my way over to Europe and to London and do some fun wine dinners over there. So the next wine, let's keep moving on. We have so much we can talk about with the Monte Bello here, the 16. This was at that 5th year of drought. We have virtually no irrigation in this vineyard. I mean, it's all dry farms. The youngest vines where we just plant, I mean, that's really the only area where we have to provide irrigation to get those shallow roots trained to go deep. We'll do these intervals, infrequent but deep irrigations to really work the vines to go deeper into the soil. And once they're in that limestone, then they generally have good water resources to tap into the natural water resource and be self-sufficient. So the Monte Bello on this mountain, we have roughly 45 parcels that start off at 1,260 feet elevation. We have our Bordeaux plots all kind of on the spine of the ridge and on the south-facing slope that faces the San Andreas fault line right below us. So these 45 blocks make their way up to 2,700 feet. They're picked out over 5 weeks. Sampling, tasting, deciding by taste when to pick a piece of ground. We'll bring it into small fermenters, work the whole berries. We don't crush the fruit. So to really control and contain the tannins, we do whole berry fermentation and really work hard to come out of the fermenter with wines that are adequately structured to carry it for decades, but not so aggressively tannic that you can't enjoy it even in its youth. So here we are drinking the 16. It's super young and just fabulous. I mean, it's an opulent vintage. We brought all 4 grapes into the assemblage, which is something that's kind of a telling sign of a quality vintage on this mountain to actually have optimal ripeness to get even Franc and Petit Verdot ripe. Those are the 2 varieties that are often the most difficult to get to full ripeness. If it's not warm enough, Petit Verdot will crash. If it's too hot, Petit Verdot will crash. If it's too dry, Petit Verdot will crash. Franc, it's hit and miss. It's something that comes in every few years. So 16 vintage, actually all 4 grapes came in. So we got 72% Cab, Sauv. We've got 12 Merlot. I want to say 10% Petit Verdot and 6 Cab Franc. So that's a healthy amount of Petit Verdot. It's generally never that high. And so that really is a sign that it went very well that year in growing the vines on Monte Bello. And we were able to get everything to a point of really good quality of flavor. We fermented it very carefully. we barrel down everything. So after vinification, we send everything to barrel to have some time apart. As they're settling, as they're finishing malolactic in barrel, you know, we can begin to pull barrel samples and begin the assemblage process, which is done blind. So we line up the flights, we taste through, everything is randomized. We don't want to just taste Cab and make a ranking, taste Merlot and make a ranking. Everything is intermixed, tasted against each other. Everything on the property is given a fair chance to make it into the assemblage. It's really comes down to, within our favorite glasses, which ones are really showing the Montebello character very well. And then once they're identified, we have to see how well they play together in the assemblage. You know, can we build upon the synergies? Is an addition going to take the quality down? So we have to recognize that. So we go through a lot of tasting, all these different blend iterations to get to a final glass for the assemblage. And then we blind taste against the past like 5 vintages to make sure that the new vintage really does fit within the character and quality of recent bottlings of Montebello. So 16 is definitely one of the, it's going to be a long-lived vintage. I say 30 years on the back label, but you know, easily could see this going out 40 years. It's just got so much intensity to the nose. You know, you can smell the minerals, you can smell the mountain fruit, the cassis. There's even hints of kind of proper Cabernet herbaceousness, which we kind of feel is classic. It's, you know, something that is unique to our terroir to have some of these really wonderful kind of dried tobacco, you know, and kind of bay trees. And we have a lot of aromatic chaparral growing in the vicinity of the vineyard. So that's all part of what makes up the great terroir of Montebello. And it's got high acid, and it's got a good backbone of tannin. I mean, it's really going to be able to live a very long time. And now we have a 2002 as a great example of great ageability. And I decanted this earlier. And so we'll see. I tasted when I first poured it in, it was really beautiful. But now with some time airing out, oh, it's potent. I mean, this is why you hold on to these wines forever. I mean, they just get to this special place. And 2002, actually, you could say is a very comparable vintage to 16. It was dry, low yield, hot summer. It was a really strong, really dark, serious wine when it was young. We only made about 2,000 cases of it. That was the year we kind of playing around with this idea of inserting a intermediary selection between it and our entry point Cab. We called it Home Ranch, and we sold it here, I think mostly in the US. I don't think we exported it. And so that really it allowed us to make a super selection of Montebello, which was really powerful, very concentrated. This year's blend is 74 Cab Sauv, 18 Merlot, 8 Petit Verdot, and no Franc. This was actually the year the Franc it didn't get to ripeness. We actually pulled it out and bottled it separately and sold it here at the tasting room. So without the Franc, I mean, it is missing one of the 4 grapes we have. It could be missing just a little bit of the complexity. I love Franc. I mean, what it brings to the blend is aromatics. I mean, it's more of a medium weight wine. It doesn't have the depth and structure of Cabernet Sauvignon, but it does have this beautiful racy juniper berry herbaceousness and perfumed fruit that really can add exotic quality to the blend. But, you know, Petit Verdot is also a really wonderful blending grape. It's got the violets, the fennel, the licorice notes. It can really bring in the depth of fruit as well. And Merlot, of course, is the plushness, the bramble fruit. It's going to kind of round out the tannins. I think Cabernet Sauvignon, as the heart of Montebello, is a very solid, you know, dense, really well-structured wine. And so it's going to give give this wine a lot of depth, and you know, it's really what carries Montebello for decades. And when you go back to the early vintages of Montebello that the founders worked with, and when Paul joined, what he was working with, all they had here was Cabernet Sauvignon. It wasn't until 1974 that a small amount of Merlot was planted. In 68, those vines were mature enough by 74 to bring a small addition to the blend, and they liked what it did in helping kind of bring a little more appeal to the Cabernet tannins. And then as time went on, the vineyard, as it was being planted out further, included more Merlot, Petit Verdot by the late 80s, Cab Franc in the early 70s, but it was kind of hit and miss, never really a major player in the blend. So really the Cab Sauv, Merlot, and Petit Verdot really at the heart of Montebello all these decades, and have made some of the most ageable wine in North America and in the world. And when you smell this Montebello, I mean, the 2002, it's just so perfumed and really deep, and oh, yeah, it could easily be mistaken as first growth Bordeaux. And even the American oak that we're using in a high percent, I mean, it's brand new American oak that comes into the cellar every year. 2002 would have had at least 97% new American oak barrels as part of its aging, and a little bit of French. And yet it has totally integrated into the flavors. There's no obvious typical American oak flavors showing. It's a really harmonious wine with so much flavor intensity and complexity. But now I should open it up to the questions. Now we've tasted everything. If Ronan is going to join, maybe he'll read some off. I'm sure there's a lot of Q&As.
Hey, Eric, fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Really fantastic. I'd love to see your passion about what you do. I can tell you really love your job.
Yes.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions in the box. So first of all, how do you decide how much water is given back in a vintage? Is it based on ABV or other factors?
It's really seeing how much dehydration had occurred on the fruit before we picked. It's only done if there's a heat wave during harvest. We can't get into the block to pick fast enough. If the berries begin to dehydrate just enough and dimple back, we'll try to take it back to what they should have been before the heat wave, just to bring the ABV down to kind of our typical alcohol level, which is for Zinfandel going to be 14.5 and under.
Okay.
And it's done in the fermenter, so in the fermenting grapes. That's the best way to get it to integrate. And we feel that's a better way to control the alcohol content than sending the wine out to have the alcohol removed by spinning cone or reverse osmosis. Those techniques there just really ruin the wine and the character.
Okay. And Dave is asking, he may have missed this from earlier, but why the choice to use American oak with Cabernet?
Well, it goes back to the beginning of time at Ridge. I mean, Paul had read some research provided to him from a friend from Bordeaux who was operating a chateau. And there was a study done in the 1800s in the first growth where they did oak trials like we do every year here at Montebello, where they filled the barrel. You know, they had 5 different barrel types from different regions of the world. American oak was included in that study. Center of France, you know, the Baltic region, you know, Hungarian. They tried all these different oaks with their it was a multi-year study, multiple vintages at the first growth. They tasted blind, they created a ranking, and in the ranking, the favorite oaks were the Slavic oaks, the Baltic oaks, and then American oak was right in the middle. Dead last was French oak, center of France. And so Paul felt pretty confident that, you know, American oak could work really well here at Montebello. The other thing was that Montebello was such a unique wine in the world of wine. You know, if we threw it all in French oak, it would really just taste like Bordeaux, imitation Bordeaux. Paul did not want to make Montebello taste like everything else. You know, a lot of the other Cabernet producers at the time were all running towards French oak and trying to imitate Bordeaux. Ridge wanted to do something totally different and respect the terroir that we have here and make a wine that really could stand out on its own. And American oak really has allowed Montebello to be that really unique wine in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it absolutely worked.
Yeah, yeah.
So Dave's asking, how do you use 2-inch corks in all of your wines, and who is your
I do, except for one wine that we don't export. It's kind of our earliest drinking entry-level Zinfandel. It's a Sonoma County General blend. We use 1 3/4-inch cork, so it's kind of on a faster track for drinkability. But everything else is 2-inch. I go out to 2 1/4-inch for our magnums, even longer for the large format bottles. And everything is tested for TCA, so I'm only using tested corks today and have been for, gosh, about 2 years now that the technology is there to really ensure that every single bottle is going to be at its best when a consumer has spent the time collecting and aging. And, you know, there's so much that goes into it that, you know, it's a real shame if all our hard work is ruined by the cork. But yet I don't want to give up on using cork because ultimately that's the best closure. So today with the tested corks, every single cork can be assured that it does not have cork taint.
Okay. And Jeremy asks, do you have a view on how long you should leave Geyserville before opening? He's tasting a 10-year-old. It's delicious but young.
It is, yeah. I mean, I like Geyserville when it's about 10 years. So like right now, 2008, 2007 are drinking really well. You know, they really do take their time. But that could be said for pretty much all our Zinfandels. You know, kind of the minimum I would say is about 5 years, waiting 5 years. And in that time range, you know, we do make some Zins that unfortunately don't get over to the UK that are kind of the Zins that are softer. You can drink them younger. They're more about fruit and not so much about tannin structure. So like our Suzy Ranch Paso Robles Zinfandel, that's one of those Zins you can drink early. Same with the Three Valleys Zinfandel, the Sonoma County blend. That's all about early drinkability.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've served Geyserville in every restaurant I've ever worked in. I've put it in the wine list, and it's delicious young, it's delicious slightly mature, and it's delicious very mature. So it's just a great wine at all stages, I'd say.
Yes, yes.
But David's asking, what do you get from 2% Alicante Boucher?
Just a good hit of color. I mean, it's one of the Centuria grapes. It's special. It's fully pigmented flesh and skin, so it's the darkest grape on the planet. When I'm sampling it in the vineyard, you crush it up in your hand. It's just inky juice everywhere, and it stains everything. But it generally comes into the Geyserville blend or even the Lytton Springs through co-fermentation. So it's picked among that block with the Zin and the other varieties and thrown together. So it's like a big stew. You've got all the grapes at different color spectrum, different tannins and flavors, all sitting there fermenting together. And the ultimate wine that comes out that you press off is just going to be so deep and rich and complex. And it's hard to replicate that if you fermented everything apart as finished wine and back blended to those same percentages. It's not going to be the same thing. There's something really magical about co-fermentation. It's what I call alchemy. I mean, it's something that you end up with something so much grander and more amazing than if you tried to replicate it with pure parts. It's something, yeah, you can't explain it. It's just this weird chemistry that happens, you know, fusion of all the different color molecules and flavors.
And it's deep and dark without adding more tannin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, but 2% is just enough. I mean, I could taste a 0.5% addition of Alicante to a blend, and what it will do to the body and the color. So 2% is a pretty good, healthy amount to have in a blend.
And so Johnny is asking, how do Lytton Springs and Geyserville each develop as they age to 10 years and beyond? And he's conscious that most people don't really age Zinfandel.
I know, and that's the shame. I mean, probably one of the few people in the world that gets to enjoy that. I mean, hopefully there's other collectors out there that do it. Just either by sheer volume, they have so much of it in their cellar that it just gets the age. But I did intentionally because I just absolutely love the flavor profile that a 10 and 20-year-old Zinfandel will develop into. Right now, as these young 17s, they are really jammy and fruity and intense. But 10 years out, the fruit subsides enough, the fruit kind of converts, they begin to take on kind of like a baked dessert, cherry pie, burnt crust like flavor, tannins are softer. They just are so delicious. And then when they're 20 years out, they start to take on some of the tertiary flavors. More of the earth comes through, the gravel at Lytton, the gravel at Geyserville, the clay at Lytton. You start to see more of their terroir. You know, every year we host sommeliers across from the U.S. and they come out here. We do this really elaborate blind tasting where it's the Geyserville Lytton Springs blind tasted through usually 30 years. And so we have to pick and choose what we think each one is. And I can usually spot it 100% of the time because the vineyard personality transpires through time. You can actually still tell what is Geyserville Lytton Springs with 30 years of age, where the fruit is no longer totally obvious. It's more the vineyard characteristic shows through stronger.
Okay. And yeah. Peter says, thank you very much for a brilliant session. And he'd like to hear your view on the best Monte Bello vintage to be drinking right now.
Gosh, you know, that's a tough one because there's so many great vintages. I kind of think about, well, personally in my cellar, what I had recently was a 97. You know, the vintage of that century. It was like the year of years, like superb quality across the board for everything. That is the vintage right now that is just drinking so nicely. And, you know, I know sadly for Napa, there was a lot of hype about 97. You know, they thought they had knocked it out of the park as like the best vintage ever, but a lot of those wines just have not held with time. And so they're all kind of on the downhill slope. Monte Bello is still climbing and just getting better. And it's so seamless right now. And when you pull the cork and decant, you smell the elixir of Monte Bello. The aroma, I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful wine. So that's the exciting vintage right now for me.
So Torbjorn is asking, just briefly, can you talk about the vintages 2006 and onwards for Monte Bello? It's a long question, but can you?
Oh yeah, I mean, gosh, you know, with climate change, you know, it's been tricky. We've had a lot of calamity with weather, with droughts, floods, bad weather during bloom. We've had forest fires. I mean, it's just the weather has not been steady since that period of time. But, you know, we've been able to make amazing Monte Bellos through it by being really careful about the selection process and pulling off, really being careful about farming and also really controlling the viticulture and fermentation. So 2006 is very well structured. 2007 is a very elegant, very drinkable wine right now. 2008 is extremely structured and tannic. You need much more patience. And then you go to 2009 and it's gorgeous, very drinkable, you know, opulent. And then 10 is well weighted. 11 was super soft and elegant because it was a El Nino year, very cold, very wet, tough growing season, but really elegant, very Bordeaux-like. And then 12, 13, just get more concentrated with those drought years. 14, uber concentrated because it was the driest year. 15 hardly made any. The yields were really low, but it made a really beautiful drinkable vintage. 16, of course, we have here, well structured. Really, it's an even year. So I see this thing with odd year, even year. There's like the character of fruit, and you can almost go back to like it's a 10-year cycle as well. So yeah, 76, 96, 86 I kind of have to leave out. That was a totally different year. But the 16 is very much like 6, very much like 96. Very full, very structured, very weighty wine with a really strong red spectrum fruit. You see that also with kind of the growing seasons, like where does the heat of the vintage fall? Like, 16, we had a lot of heat in June, July. It cooled in August, September. And then we had heat kind of in the days of harvest in October. What that did was kind of keep the fruit character more towards red. In seasons where it's cool in June, July, August, and then heat September, October, that's when you go into these darker, deeper blue, black fruit spectrum vintages. And in blind tasting, I can usually spot vintages based on those characteristics of the fruit spectrum, the tannin structure, how acidic, which kind of indicates like how cold it was at night, how long was the growing season. But yeah, there's a lot of variables at play in making Montebello.
Great, thank you. And so Miriam, who I know that you know, because she
yes,
she's asking, could you speak about the 19 vintage and about the assemblage for 19 Montebello?
Well, it turned out a delicious wine. I got barrels right here. I've been tasting a lot of them. It's got all 4 grapes in the mix, so it's got I think 68% Cabernet Sauvignon, every drop of Merlot. It was a really tough Merlot vintage. They were all in bloom during bad weather, so the yields got knocked back, but the quality Merlot in 19 was so fine, so every drop of it went in. And it's only about 10% of the blend. And then Petit Verdot got fully ripe, the Cap Franc got fully ripe, and they're in there for about same 10% or 4% of Franc. It's a really glorious wine. Now, yields in California for a lot of the vineyards were up. We had a lot of rainfall in the winter of 19. And then also the vines kind of reacted to better rainfall in 17. So it kind of set the vines up to have their primordial buds staged to put out clusters in 19 vintage. And so we got a lot of fruit in 19. So we had to be really careful in 19 here at Montebello about trimming back the fruit because our summer was cold. We didn't really come into summer until, late June. It was a really long winter, not much of a spring. It was really wet, really cold. So we really didn't start to see heat until we got into harvest. And that was what really helped bring up the ripeness. The alcohol of the Montebello 19 right now is 13.7. So we did get to full ripeness, and it produced a really, really dense, dark, serious wine with really beautiful dimension and richness. Same could be said for the shards right now that are barrel fermenting. They're finishing. I've been tasting there, and they're all looking superb. Same with the Zinfandels. They're all really opulent, I want to say, but also sensuous. So there's really good deep flavors in the Zinfandels this year, but they're not overly tannic. They're really drinkable. They're all going to be Zins that you can really drink at release. But I still do hope that Geyserville, it is showing more structure now that it's getting some bottle or some barrel age. So it's starting to lose some of its baby fat and show more of its backbone of structure. I think it's got good aging potential. But when I first assembled it, barreled it down, tasting it, I was like, oh man, this wine needs more Petit Syrah because it just seems so soft. But now tasting it as it's had some time in oak, it's really starting to get much more rigid and more structured. And that's something we see with the wines as they age and evolve in the cellar. They do change, and that's why it's so important to continue tasting the wines, not just for the quality and preserving quality and making sure the wines are microbially stable, but also just that they have really begun, that they really have great balance and structure, because we want these wines to age. And it's essential to constantly be tasting.
Great. So Johnny, who's a big fan of your wines, I know a big fan of Californian wines, is asking us about the Cabernet estate. He really likes the 2000
Yeah,
and
yeah,
says fantastic
that's
quality.
that's the baby Montebello. So that is also from Montebello, but it's from different parts of the mountain that have historically not made Montebello. So it's in pockets where there's swales, there's kind of these deep terraces and areas where there's better water resources reaching the vines. The vines there in those particular pieces on the mountain are going to produce berries that are juicier, going to have better fruit definition, not so much tannin. And so those are the core pieces that make the estate bottling. So they're on the Montebello terroir, but they don't have the tannin and phenolic profile to come together to make the 50-year long-lived Montebello. So in the fermenter, those parcels are treated more delicately, more gently, and we're really trying to make the estate Cabernet a version of Montebello that you can drink and enjoy on the young side. So the estate Cab, it's going to be good at release. It's going to get better and, hold to about 15 years out. Whereas Montebello starts to get better when it's had at least 10 years of bottle age, and then it gets even better beyond that.
Great, Eric. So really there's one last question, which is from Jeremy, that says he'd love to hear your comments on the 2004 Montebello.
Oh, such a wonderful wine. I mean, one of my favorites. It was a tough year for Zinfandel. It was kind of like two harvests. We had the Zin harvest come in mid-August. We finished it by late August. It was unusually early there. Down here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the weather couldn't have been so more different than anywhere else in the state. It was cold. We had fog. It really slowed down the ripening of the Montebello grapes to the point where we were out into late October, early November to harvest. So it made really such a beautiful wine. I love our vintages of Montebello where we have that hang time, where the season started early for Montebello, but it finished really late. So there was so many more days where the fruit was just sitting on the vine, where the flavors were developing, the seeds were hardening. It made a Montebello that's really, I want to say, probably the closest to Chateau Margaux in character, even though it's American oak. But, when you taste it, it's just got that finesse and silkiness and just such racy flavors. And yeah, it's perfumed and beautiful. Right. One of my favorite vintages.
Thank you very much, Eric. So all I can say is there's obviously a lot of love out there for ridge wines, and I think the passion and the enthusiasm that you've shown in these wines tonight, I think for every ridge fan, we're very assured that you're going to carry on Mr. Draper's work as well.
I will. Yes, and that's the plan. I love what I do so much here that, yeah, I could not imagine doing anything anywhere else. I mean, when you're given this special vineyard to work with, I mean, I started with no winemaking experience, joined Ridge, learned everything I've learned from Paul and by basically self-taught and doing it myself. I can't imagine doing this anywhere else. I mean, there's nowhere else that would be more, that could top out Montebello. I mean, this is really one of the great vineyards of the world.
Well, you're doing a fantastic job, and we hope to be enjoying those vintages for many years to come. So thank you.
Yes, yeah. I don't plan on getting COVID-19, so I will keep self-isolated. And also, I think wine is really helpful for good health.
Yeah, building up the immune system.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a good several glasses of good red wine every day. and occasionally white. I mean, I wish we just made more white wine. I mean, I would drink it more frequently, but you know, for now, you know, Zen, Cab, I mean, everything in my cellar, I've been rating everything that I've got in there, you know, to make do during these really tough times when, you know, you need some enjoyment in your life when things just are not very pleasant being contained.
Well, I mean, all I can say is thank you so much to you and to the Ridge team. Members have definitely enjoyed it, and we hope to see you in London.
I will, yeah. As soon as this is all over, that's my first stop. I want to see Miriam, and well, I want to wish her also a happy birthday. Today's her birthday.
Is it her birthday?
Yeah.
Oh, happy birthday, Miriam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Eric. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your day, and yeah, see you soon.
Okay. We'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.